Rome, the first year of the 2nd century of the Common Era. Well before dawn has touched the 7 hills, in the collina of a narrow-fronted domus on the lower Caelian hill, a man of perhaps 30 crouches over a clay hearth to blow life into last night's coals. He is a slave. His name is not recorded. In a city where some households ran to hundreds of slaves and the smallest ran to 2 or 3, he is one of perhaps 9 belonging to a grain merchant of equestrian rank, and his first task each morning is the same as every morning: to have the kitchen fire burning, water drawn from the cistern in the yard, and the bread bought from the bakery on the corner before the household begins to stir. He works in darkness. The lamp in the collina burns olive oil and gives enough light to see his hands. Outside, Rome is already making noise. This is Rome in the year 100 of the Common Era. The city holds approximately 1 million inhabitants inside the circuit of the Servian Wall and its surrounding neighborhoods, making it by any measure the largest human settlement on Earth. The Emperor Trajan, who has held power for 2 years following the death of Nerva, is at the beginning of what will prove a long and productive reign. The forum he will build, the largest ever constructed in Rome, is still being planned, but the city itself is already complete in all its essential contradictions. The greatest engineering civilization the ancient world has yet produced. Living inside buildings it cannot always keep from burning down. This documentary has been reconstructed using the accounts of Juvenal, whose 3rd satire describes the noise, danger, and misery of the Roman insula with uncomfortable precision, the letters of Pliny the Younger, who grew up in precisely the kind of household this film follows, the technical treatise of Sextus Julius Frontinus, who served as curator aquarum, guardian of the city's water supply, and who published his 2-volume account of Rome's aqueducts in the years 97 and 98, just 3 years before this particular morning, and the epigrams of Martial, who complained with enough specificity about the privations of ordinary Roman domestic life that historians have been able to reconstruct its rhythms in detail. The archaeological record from Ostia Antica, Rome's port city and the best preserved example of imperial-era urban housing, provides the physical dimensions of rooms, staircases, and shared courtyards that no text alone could supply. By the year 100, the city of Rome contained, according to the later regionary catalogues that counted such things, approximately 46,000 insulae and fewer than 1:800 private domus. The ratio was not accidental. It described a city where the overwhelming majority of residents lived vertically, stacked in rented rooms above street-level shops, while a small fraction lived horizontally, behind walls that faced inward. The thread this film will follow runs through the fosses of one of those private houses and stays there for a single day. The domus belongs to the grain merchant. It is not large by the standards of the senatorial class, but it is solid. 2 stories of tufa stone faced in brick, a roof of fired terracotta tile, and a floor plan that unfolds inward in the sequence that Vitruvius, writing a century before this morning, described as the proper order of a Roman house. From the street it presents a blank face. The shuttered shop fronts on either side of the entrance passage belong to the merchant as well and are rented to a fuller on the left and a small food counter on the right. The door itself, of seasoned oak with iron fittings, is opened each dawn by the ostiarius, the doorkeeper, who has slept in the small cell beside it on a low pallet. The fosses is perhaps 15 feet long and 5 feet wide, floored in tessellated black and white stone in a simple lozenge pattern. This passage is not merely an entrance. It is a declaration. The street outside is cobblestone, loud, smelling of animal dung, frying fat, and the breath of a city without adequate sewers. The fosses cuts that world off in 15 paces. By the time a visitor reaches the atrium, the street has ceased to exist. The atrium is the heart of the house. It is roughly 30 feet long and 20 wide, open to the sky through a rectangular aperture in the roof called the compluvium, and beneath that opening sits the impluvium, a shallow marble-edged pool fed by whatever rain falls through the gap above. On a morning in early autumn, the light through the compluvium arrives at a low angle, catching the water's surface and throwing pale reflected shapes across the plastered walls. The walls themselves are painted in a deep red scheme on the lower register, with architectural illusions on the upper. False columns, false doorways, landscapes that go nowhere. The merchant had them done when he moved in 12 years ago. In a niche on the east wall of the atrium, beside a small marble table, stands the lararium. This is the household shrine, and it is the first thing the paterfamilias attends to each morning, before he speaks to anyone or eats anything. The lararium in this house takes the form of a small edicule, a miniature temple front in stucco, with 2 painted columns and a triangular pediment, inside which stand 3 small bronze figurines, the lar familiaris, the protective spirit of the household, and 2 penates, guardians of the storeroom and provisions. Below them, on a narrow shelf, sit 2 terracotta lamps that burn through the night. At dawn, the merchant stands before this shrine in a clean tunic, his head covered with a fold of his toga, and speaks the morning prayer. The formula follows a tradition old enough that Cato the Elder described it in essentially the same terms 2 centuries earlier. A request for the protection of the household, a small offering of wine poured into a shallow dish, a few grains of salt placed on the altar below the figurines. The lararium is not ceremonial in any distant or formal sense. It sits at eye level in a room the entire household crosses multiple times each day. It is the center of the house in the same practical way the hearth is. By the time the merchant has completed his devotions and the kitchen slave has laid out the first meal of the day, the clients have begun to arrive. The salutatio, the formal morning greeting between patron and client, is one of the organizing rituals of Roman social life. It happens at dawn every morning the patron is in the city. The ostiarius opens the door and admits visitors in order of social rank. First, a young man whose father the merchant knew in the grain trade, then 2 freedmen of the household who have established their own small businesses across the Tiber and who owe their patron a formal visit each morning in exchange for his continued legal protection, then a scribe who lives in an insula 3 streets away and hopes for a letter of introduction to a business contact in the port of Ostia. They wait in the atrium, standing near the walls, not approaching the impluvium. When the merchant appears from the tablinum, the room that occupies the space between the atrium and the peristyle behind, the exchange is brief, a formal greeting, a few words of business, the handing of a small packet of coins to each client by the merchant's secretary, a freedman named Philemon who keeps the household accounts. The tablinum is open to the atrium on one side and can be screened with curtains on the other. From his chair in it, the merchant can see the entire atrium and everyone in it. The atrium is a theater of social position, and the patron seated in the tablinum is its audience and its director simultaneously. What the clients see when they wait is everything the merchant wants them to see. The mosaic floor of the tablinum, the bronze bust of his father on a pillar beside the entrance, the painted garden scene visible through the gap between the tablinum curtain and the doorway to the peristyle beyond. What the clients cannot see is the garden itself. The peristyle is the private territory of the house, separated from the semi-public atrium by the tablinum and a low wooden rail. The garden is planted in herbs and 2 small bay trees trained to either side of a low marble fountain basin. On the colonnaded portico surrounding it, ceramic pots hold rose cuttings. The domina, the merchant's wife, conducts the business of the household from a chair placed near the garden in the morning, when the light is good. She supervises the cook, the 2 body slaves who attend her and her daughters, and the pedagogus, a Greek-educated freedman who serves as tutor to the merchant's 2 sons. The daughters are not in formal lessons. They are learning from their mother. On the opposite side of the street, directly across from the oak door of the domus, stands a 5-story insula. Juvenal, writing in these same years, described the terror of the upper floor tenant with a precision that suggests personal experience. By the time smoke from a fire on the ground floor had reached the 3rd story, he wrote, the residents below were already roaring for water and carrying their possessions to safety, while those at the top learned of the emergency last and had the least time to act. The insula across the street is of the kind that had become common since Nero's building reforms after the Great Fire of 64 CE. Its lower 2 stories are of solid brick. Its upper floors are of the cheaper opus Craticium construction, a lattice of wooden laths covered with mud plaster, whitewashed to look like stone. The ground floor holds a thermopolium, a counter-service food shop open to the street, selling heated lentil stew, bread, and olives. Above the shop, residents live in sonacula, self-contained apartments of 2 or 3 rooms, distributed vertically in a social gradient as precise as anything in the merchant's atrium. The most expensive apartment on the first floor above the shops is occupied by a retired soldier and his family, and the cheapest unit, a single room under the roof tiles, belongs to a cloth dyer who shares it with his apprentice and keeps his charcoal brazier burning through the night. Neither the retired soldier nor the cloth dyer has running water. The insula has no pipe connection to the aqueduct system. Frontinus, writing his account of the city's water supply just 3 years before this morning, noted that Rome's 9 aqueducts fed 39 monumental fountains and over 500 public basins, but that virtually no residential apartment building received water directly. The poet Martial, whose own house was of a similarly modest kind, complained in an epigram that his dwelling lacked water, even though an aqueduct murmured nearby. Residents of the insula carry their water each morning from the nearest lacus, one of the hundreds of public stone basins fed continuously from the distribution network. The nearest one is 60 yards from the building. The cloth dyer on the top floor makes that walk twice a day, carrying 2 clay amphorae on a wooden yoke. The domus has a water connection. A lead pipe runs from the distribution network to a cistern beneath the yard at the back of the house. The household uses this water for cooking, for washing, for the garden fountain. It is a privilege purchased by registration with the Imperial Water Authority, and it is, more than the painted walls or the mosaic floors, the clearest single difference between the world inside the oak door and the world outside it. By mid-morning, the salutatio is over and the clients have left. The merchant has walked to the forum with Philemon to settle a contract dispute with a shipper from Puteoli. The domus settles into its daytime rhythm. The cook is at work in the culina, a room barely larger than a closet tucked against the back wall of the house, equipped with a low brick hearth over which pots rest on iron trivets. There is no chimney. Smoke escapes through a small opening in the rear wall and collects in the yard before dispersing. The cook is preparing the cena, the main meal of the day, which will be served in the early evening. A fish course, lentils cooked with cumin and coriander, bread, olives, and wine, diluted with water from the cistern. Rome by the year 100 was served by 11 aqueducts. Frontinus, who had spent 2 years as curator aquarum learning the system before he published his report, calculated that the daily flow entering the city was substantial enough to supply every resident. But the distribution was never equal. The imperial household received water from dedicated lines. The public baths, numbering in the hundreds across the city, took their supply next. The monumental fountains and the public lacus for residential areas came after. Private house connections were last. For the great majority of the city's residents, water was not something that arrived. It was something that had to be fetched, carried and stored before it ran out. In the afternoon, the question of waste becomes as insistent as the question of water. The domus has a latrina, a single room off the yard at the back, positioned near the kitchen in the Roman custom of placing practical functions together. It sits above a cesspit dug into the ground below the house, and it is not connected to the city sewer. Connection of private homes to the Cloaca Maxima, the great central sewer that drains into the Tiber, was technically possible by this date but uncommon. The practical problem of sewer gases, which had no trap to contain them, made connections to the main drainage channel difficult and sometimes dangerous. The pit beneath the domus is emptied by a gang of hired men, the stercorarii, who come at night every several months and carry the waste in sealed containers to sell as fertilizer to farms outside the city walls. For the residents of the insula across the street, there is no pit of their own. The building has no latrina. Public foricai, the communal latrines built near markets, baths, and major street corners, serve the need during the day. At night, chamber pots serve in the rooms, and the contents, by morning, need to go somewhere. Juvenal addresses what happens next with the controlled fury of a man who has navigated the night streets of Rome and narrowly escaped what fell from above. The law allows the injured party to go to court and claim damages. The law does not prevent the next occurrence. By late afternoon, the sun has moved past the compluvium and the atrium is in shadow. The domina has received a neighbor for a visit that extended well past the midday rest. The merchant's 2 sons have returned from their morning lessons and are in the atrium with wooden tablets and styluses, copying Greek vocabulary. The younger daughter, 9 years old, is in the cubicula with her nurse. The cubicula, the sleeping rooms, open off the atrium on both sides, screened by curtains rather than hinged doors. They are small, perhaps 10 feet by 12, lit during the day by narrow windows giving onto the interior yard, furnished with a wooden bed frame, a cedar chest, and a bronze hook on the wall. There is no hearth. In winter, a portable bronze brazier would be moved in for warmth. By night, the charcoal burning in it would do the same work it did in the cloth dyer's room across the street, but here, within walls of stone thick enough to retain something of the day's heat. The boundary between the domus and the street is the line the film returns to throughout the day, because it is the sharpest line in the city. On one side of the oak door, water arrived through a pipe. Morning prayers were offered at a lit shrine. The smoke of cooking went upward through a dedicated opening. Children learned Greek verbs from an educated tutor. On the other side of that door, within 100 yards, families carried water twice daily in clay amphorae. Waste went out the window after dark, and sleep was interrupted by the grinding of iron cartwheels on cobblestone that the city's traffic laws pushed entirely into the nighttime hours. The two worlds were not separated by distance. They shared a street. At dusk, the merchant returns from the forum. He pauses in the fosses to exchange outdoor shoes for house sandals. In the atrium, the lamps have been lit. Oil lamps on iron stands near the impluvium and the perpetual flame in the lararium. The smell of the cena coming from the kitchen has reached every room. The cena is served in the triclinium, the dining room that opens off the atrium to the right. 3 low dining couches are arranged on 3 sides around a central table. The mosaic floor is the most expensive single object in the house. A geometric pattern in black, white, and terracotta with a border of stylized sea creatures laid by a Campanian workshop when the merchant first occupied the property. The merchant and his wife recline on their respective couches. The elder children join them. The younger children have eaten in the kitchen. The conversation over the meal touches on the prices at the harbor at Portus, where the merchant's agent has been negotiating the cost of Egyptian grain. Trajan's administration has been attentive to the supply of the annona, the system by which the state supplies grain to a substantial portion of the city's population, and the political implications of grain prices are familiar to every equestrian who trades in them. While the household's formal business concludes at the triclinium table, the city outside operates in its own register. The 12 tables, the ancient code of Roman law, prohibited wheeled vehicles from city streets during daylight to prevent gridlock, which meant that the heavy carts bringing grain, building stone, and amphorae of oil and wine to the city's markets operated entirely in darkness. From the early evening onward, the streets outside the domus filled with the grinding of iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestone and the shouts of drivers. The noise of a Roman night was a civic fact that every writer of the period remarked on. Juvenal claimed it was impossible to sleep in the city at all. Martial noted that school teachers began their lessons before dawn, and money changers clinked coins on their tables while it was still dark. The merchant's household registered none of this as unusual. It was the background condition of life in Rome. After the meal, the kitchen slave cleared the triclinium and began the cycle of washing and storage that would keep him occupied until late in the evening. The merchant spent an hour in the tablinum reviewing accounts with Philemon. The domina supervised the preparation of the house for the night, the dousing of lamps in unoccupied rooms, the locking of the front door, instructions to the ostiarius about who was expected the following morning. One of the household slaves, passing the stairwell, noticed a crack in the plaster of the upper wall. A note was made to call in a plasterer. In the insula across the street, the same kind of crack in the same kind of plaster received a different response. The building's manager propped a wooden beam against the wall from outside and told the tenants it would hold. Juvenal described exactly this transaction in his third satire. The house at night was lit only where necessary. The lararium flame was the one exception to the rationing of oil, and through the compluvium above the impluvium, a rectangle of night sky was visible, occasionally crossed by smoke from a neighbor's fire. The film steps out through the oak door into the street at the last moment, just as the merchant's household goes dark. A torch bracket on the insula wall across the street holds a burning resin torch, one of the few fixed sources of light on this block, and beneath it stands a boy of perhaps 12, leaning against the wall and eating a piece of bread. He is the cloth dyer's apprentice who has come down from the 5th floor to use the corner latrina and has not yet gone back up. Above him, in the successive stories of the insula, Windows show thin lines of orange light from lamps and braziers burning in the rooms. Higher up, near the roofline where the cloth dyer lives, nothing. The people at the top are already in darkness. The narrator's voice returns one final time to the question that the whole day has been assembling. What did it mean to live in the greatest city on earth in the year 100? For the grain merchant behind the oak door, it meant a house organized around the management of rank, the painted atrium for receiving clients, the lararium to anchor the household within the favor of the gods, the mosaic triclinium to mark the standing of a man of equestrian order at his own table. These things were real, and they carried weight. But they existed inside a city where 46,000 apartment buildings stood on foundations of wood and mud plaster, where the same aqueduct network that fed the cistern under the merchant's yard left the upper floors of the insula, with no option but to carry water in clay amphorae from a public basin 60 yards away, and where the distance between the tile roof of the domus and the whitewashed plaster of the insula above it was the distance between one administrative registration and the next. It would take 3 more centuries for the aqueducts themselves to fail. When they did, the fountains, the public baths, the private cisterns, and the lararium lamps of the merchant's successors would all go dry at roughly the same time. Until then, the city maintained its order. The oak door at the end of the fosses held its world intact, and the cloth dyer's apprentice finished his bread and climbed 5 flights of stairs back to a room that had no water, no shrine, and no view of the sky.